Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Well, today we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and the Ukraine. Now, today the Russians continue. It's a very methodical breakthrough to the direction of the northwest of Avdiivka, and to a lesser extent to the southwest as well. The Ukrainians continue to have the inability to establish new defensive lines after the Russians crushed the Ukrainian defensive network around Avdiivka. And just a real quick summary here of the last few days via this pro-Ukrainian resource map that we continue to use, the Deep State map. And we'll just go back just a couple of days, and you, the viewer, can see what essentially is happening. Again, April 27th, 28th, 29th, 30th, May 1st, and then obviously that's where we're at today. But it continues, and it's very difficult for Ukrainian forces on the front lines as we speak. Now, what is the one great issue regarding the Russian military that has shocked the Western world? Well, there's two issues. The first issue was the belief that the Russians were, one, sustaining very large numbers of casualties. Early in the conflict, we have seen lots of Russian tanks being destroyed in column, moving over roadways by more advanced anti-tank guided weapon systems. And it was the belief that those systems, many of these tanks, armored fighting vehicles, the Russians would not be able to replace. And then secondly, it was the belief that the Russians were essentially fighting an old way of war, an outdated way of war, and that drones, the ability to sense and shoot, the ability to utilize anti-tank guided weapon systems, long-range artillery, was negating the Russian mass and maneuver capability. Now, what the West is learning is, one, that the Russians are producing systems at an unprecedented rate. The Russian military industrial capability is much greater and much more robust in terms of being able to produce both new systems and to take older systems, upgrade those systems, and then field those systems, put those systems on the battlefield. The West believed that the Russians would not be able to ramp up this quickly. The West was talking about that it would take years. It could take a better part of a decade for the Russians to reestablish any semblance of what its military looked like at the onset of hostilities. And we know now that's not the case. We know now that Russian manufacturing has greatly exceeded what the West believed was possible. Furthermore, we've seen a lot of tanks, a lot of Russian tanks being destroyed early in the campaigns. Now, we also observed a lot of tanks that were simply abandoned. If you see a tank on the battlefield, and I think this is where the media was really getting things wrong, and especially military analysts, they would see a tank and they would count that crew as KIA. And most of the time, when these Russian tanks were hit, or they encountered some sort of mechanical issue, or they ran over a mine, most of the time, the crews survived. So it was just simply a matter for that tank crew to be given another tank or infantry fighting vehicle. That's one of the big issues right now. I think the defense establishment here in the West, in the media, have really gotten wrong in terms of the amount of Russian casualties. I believe that at the end of this conflict, however this conflict ends up panning out, there's going to be a reassessment in terms of casualties. Both Russian casualties and both Ukrainian casualties. And it is of my firm belief that post-conflict, we're going to find out that indeed the Ukrainian military sustained many more casualties than the Russians. Again, an abandoned tank, a tank sitting on the side of the road that appears burnt out, does not mean the crew is killed. It simply doesn't. Now, additionally, in regards to casualties and weighing casualties for both sides, and this is very important, and I think it's one element that I've talked about before, and one element that is not being discussed in the analytical circles, and it's also not being discussed, obviously, by Western media. It is a fact that we know for the last couple of months, the Russians have been using these glide bombs a lot. And if the Russians are striking 100 aim points a day with these very large glide bombs that pack much more explosive than a traditional artillery round, inherently these systems are going to cause more casualties. The Ukrainians are not hitting 100 plus Russian aim points per day with guided aerial bombs. The best the Ukrainians are doing is attacking limited sites with ATACMS, with Storm Shadows, in a very, very limited capacity. And you can measure those strikes a half dozen to a dozen when they do launch these strikes. Then obviously the artillery strikes, but again, 155 millimeter, 105 millimeter, 122 millimeter, 130 millimeter artillery rounds are much smaller than these aerial bomb strikes that the Russians are utilizing. So, just the basics of war would lead one to believe that the force that is dropping 100 plus precision guided glide bombs per day on the enemy, that enemy is going to have more casualties than the other side. Just a fact. And that's what's happening. Now, again, the production capability of the Russians, and then furthermore, the deployment of new weapon systems that have meshed with that production capacity. The Lancet 3, That system, for instance, was very rarely ever even discussed prior to the conflict. And now it is a major contributor for the Russians in this conflict. And the Russians are mass producing those systems at an unprecedented rate. Remember, early in the conflict, going into the first 6 months, when the Russians were expending large amounts of cruise missiles, KH-101s, Calibers, even the Iskander ballistic missiles, there was talk coming out of Ukrainian intelligence that the Russians had expended their entire arsenal of cruise missiles. There were even reports that the Russians were down to about 100 cruise missiles and Iskander ballistic missiles in stockpile. Now that story has completely changed. Completely changed. Again, go look at the old news reports coming out of Ukrainian intel, in which they were stating that. Now the Ukrainians are saying that, and part of this is to get weapons and money from the West, is that the Russians have hundreds and hundreds of these systems stockpiled, and they are not running out. And again, a lot of that is that production capacity. About 7% of Russian GDP is now being used for the defense of Russia. 7%. Russian manufacturing. The average Russian factory worker, and I believe that number now in the defense sector is about 3.5 million Russians that are now working in the defense sector producing weapons for Russia. And each one of those personnel in these factories, or a very large percentage of them, are working 12-hour, 6 days a week shifts. And the Russian defense contractors and companies are continuing to expand its workforce to try and reduce those numbers of working hours, because a human can't work 6-hour days, 12 hours a day in perpetuity. You just can't. But if you look at the size and the amount of persons in that Russian workforce assigned to the defense sector, that is massive. And NATO, the United States, is now acknowledging that the Russians have no problem whatsoever supplying its front lines with weapons and systems to fight against the Ukrainians. Furthermore, it is believed the Russians are now actually stockpiling systems, weapons, cruise missiles, everything that is needed for war. The Russians are now stockpiling, in addition to producing everything that is needed for the ongoing conflict. And that has the West incredibly concerned. Because right now, the United States, Western Europe, are realizing they simply cannot match the industrial capacity of the Russian Federation. Now, this shouldn't be a monolithic surprise. The Russians had been preparing for this. The Russian state had created this infrastructure that essentially was not being used. Obviously, it took it a little bit to get it out of mothballs. It had to be oiled. It had to be cleaned. It had to be manned. But right now, it is a well-oiled machine. Far beyond anything you will see in the West. The West, NATO, the United States, they're going to have to build new factories. In Russia, those factories, those machine tools, those existed. They were there. And they're being used. And then manpower. Manpower for the Ukrainians right now is much more of a concern than the actual deployment of weapon systems to the front lines. More and more Ukrainian fighting-age males are refusing to go to the front. I have seen numerous videos that have been shot in Ukraine of Ukrainian males being kidnapped on the street by Ukrainian military personnel, placed into these military vans, and hauled off to either prison or a military barracks. And it's just not one example. There are hundreds of these examples where they are going after, I mean, quite literally, think about it. You're a male aged 20-something to 40-something. You're walking down the street in a major city or a smaller city, and the military grabs you. You're gone. That's what's happening in the Ukraine. Now, is that happening in Russia? It's not. It's absolutely not happening. The Russians are paying their fighting personnel top dollar to join the military. The sanctions. The sanctions are not having any impact on Russia. It has turned to China. It has turned to India. It has turned to other nation states. The Russian economy and the quality of life of the average Russian right now, because of this war economy, has injected all this capital into the Russian monetary system, into the actual Russian economy, that life is pretty good right now for the average Russian factory worker producing these military systems. And on top of that, then they have the ability to spend, which has actually increased consumer demand inside of Russia for Chinese goods. Not what the West had anticipated. Not at all. Not at all. So that's where we set for today. We will continue to observe and report. We're going to continue to watch things northwest of Avdiivka and other areas as well. We suspect the Russians are preparing something significant. Now, we don't know what that's going to look like. We don't know when that's going to obviously launch. But we'll be here to report it. As always, have a good day.